This week on the Catholic Vote Radio Hour,
we're not going to be able to do it very well if we shrink, if we don't stand up to this now.
I talked with Nicole Stacy from the Susan B. Anthony list about anti-Catholic bigotry and the civil rights movement.
Yeah, I'm convinced it's a conspiracy to help President Trump.
There's a shady George Soros
Right.
of the right who's funding the left. Daily Wire columnist Amanda Prestigiacomo and I talk about the intolerant students who won't let Ben Shapiro speak at Berkeley.
We were going to hide the pregnancy until I got back from basic training, but my high school girlfriend's father found out.
Filmmaker and pro-life activist Jason Jones experienced a tragedy at the age of 17 that motivates him to this day.
In the early days of broadcasting, few people realized what a fine art radio was to become.
Hello, you're listening to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour, the show within which the dogma lives loudly. I'm your host, Stephen Herreid.
If my Catholic brothers and sisters said to me, amid bigotry toward Catholics, we don't need your support in this because we have enough Catholic power to deal with it, I would still take a stand against bigotry toward Catholics because it is wrong, it is evil, and it is unjust.
With me right now is Nicole Stacy. She's the press secretary for the Susan B. Anthony list and quite a personality. Just last week, she also submitted a fantastic article to Catholic Vote. It was called Dear Anti-Catholic Left, Bigotry Lives Loudly Within You. Of course, this was in reference to Dianne Feinstein's now infamous line about a judicial candidate, the dogma lives loudly in her. What are your thoughts on this, Nicole? You made some interesting comments tying anti-Catholic bigotry to civil rights in general.
Absolutely. Well, it has been said that anti-Catholicism is the last acceptable prejudice, and we certainly see that right now because we live in a time when nobody would dream of treating, say, an African-American person or a Muslim person this way, but it's acceptable for senators to interrogate a judge on her faith in the middle of Congress.
That's right, and it was very insidious. I mean, speaking of Sidious, we actually did a cartoon with Catholic Vote that included a cameo from Darth Sidious, also known as Emperor Palpatine. Overseeing the hearing, it's Darth Vader or Darth Feinstein turns to her master and says, the dogma lives loudly in this one, master.
That was a great line, and the Catholic internet went nuts over it. We just loved it. That's not an insult to us.
Right, the dogma living loudly within us. And I just played a clip earlier that was the Reverend Martin Luther King, in the context of his civil rights activism, boldly defending Catholics against anti-Catholic bigotry.
The history both of racial bigotry and of religious bigotry in this country go back a long way. The public school system itself, it was a response of the Klan trying to educate Catholicism out of people.
Tried to educate Catholicism out of people.
Yes.
Is that what you just said?
It is. It was a threat. It was perceived as un-American. You owe your allegiance to a foreign power. The Dago Pope, as they said. And it wasn't enough for them to try to drive Catholic teachers out of the public schools. They could not abide Catholics having their own schools and running their own education, so they tried to shut those down too.
So you're saying that white racism and the KKK had access to the public schooling system?
Absolutely. In Oregon, there was a ballot measure that passed that would make public schooling compulsory, and that was based in anti-Catholic prejudice. You couldn't trust these Catholics.
Well, so Protestants are just as hated as Catholics. In fact, actually, some of the greatest civil rights activists on behalf of the unborn and on behalf of religious liberty are Protestants.
Yeah, it has made bedfellows out of us because you see the same whispering, suspicion. They can't be trusted. Their values are anti-American somehow. When Bernie Sanders was interrogating another nominee earlier this year, he in fact said something very much along the lines of, this is not what America is about, especially if you're an Orthodox believer. If you're a liberal Christian, that's just, that's okay, I guess.
Right, you're totally accepted. In fact, that's why we're seeing sort of an emboldening of the sort of Christian left. It's becoming more and more mainstream for public figures to talk about certain tenets of Orthodox Christianity, for example, the Christian opposition to abortion, as threats, as things that are not just wrong and here's why I think they're wrong. In other words, it's not just a debate. it's more of an actual smearing. It's a kind of bigotry, because what's being said is you're a threat to civil society if you hold these views.
You're a threat to other religions, other races, to LGBT, you name it. You're not what our country is about.
Now, in your article, you mentioned whisper campaigns. How did that work?
It's a tactic where rumors are spread. So-and-so is Catholic. So-and-so is Jewish. So-and-so is Christian. It's meant to appeal to a certain audience that doesn't really even need an explanation. Everybody that you're targeting knows that a certain type of people are not good for our country. And that's what we see going on with Betsy DeVos. When you see memes going around that list reasons that she's not qualified to be the Secretary of Education, one of the things that shows up on there is that she invests in Christian schools. That's just taken for granted as something that needs to be viewed with suspicion. These aren't legitimate somehow. Well, they're okay, but they're not our grand public school system, where secular values and generic American values are inculcated.
Right. It's taken as a given that a school that offers an alternative is a threat. Now, people are saying, oh, stop whining that as a Christian you are ostracized or whatever. Historically, you have no excuse to feel bad for yourself and to be worried about your status. Here's why I worry about the status of Christians, even if Christians historically have enjoyed some privilege in this country. We are the most represented demographic defending the unborn. So in other words, failing to defend ourselves against slurs and against these things that could potentially be precursors to total ostracism or even barring from public office is a failure to be a good defender of the unborn, because you're saying, I will not defend the defenders of the unborn.
Yes, and I think that's a very good point. And if you look at the civil rights movement, it was the leader of it, Dr. King, was a minister. This was a movement that spoken in the language of Christianity in a way that it was broadly accessible. And I think the pro-life movement does that very well. But we're not going to be able to do it very well if we shrink, if we don't stand up to this now.
Right. And it's similar. I mean, it would be just as wrong in the civil rights movement era if you were to say, as some sneering progressives did, if you were to poo-poo Christian activists like the Reverend Martin Luther King and others like him, and say, oh, they're old Dark Ages thinkers, and oh, they're so repressive, and so forth. If you were to poo-poo Christians and try to get them ostracized, it would be a racist act, because the welfare of marginalized groups hung on the success of the advocacy of Christians. And the same is going on now with the unborn. All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm talking right now with Nicole Stacy. She's a press secretary with the Susan B. Anthony List, and she's also just started as a columnist with Catholic Vote. You can find her work at Catholic Vote, and you can also find her work by following her on Twitter. What is your Twitter handle?
It's Nicole_in_DC. Nicole in DC.
Follow Nicole and watch her wit and wisdom play out on a day-to-day basis. It's really actually quite a thing to see.
Thank you so much.
With me now, Amanda Prestigiacomo, a writer for The Daily Wire, joins me to talk about this week's wonderful bombathon of bigotry on the left. Every day, it seems like there's another story from the left which continues to try to reelect Trump in 2020.
Right. Yeah, I'm convinced it's a conspiracy to help President Trump get another term in office, for sure.
Somewhere there's a shady George Soros of the right who's funding the left somehow. But
right.
Here's the thing. It's not just when it comes to Christianity and Catholicism. What disturbs me is that it's also when it comes to Christianity, Orthodox Christianity of any kind, including Catholicism, or Orthodox Judaism.
Yes. Emphasis on Orthodox, right. Yes.
Well, no, I mean, it's another thing that's happening this very week is that Berkeley is all up in arms about your boss, your Jewish overlord, Ben Shapiro. And he's an Orthodox Jew. He's a family man. He's pretty tame. Right. And they're treating him like a dirty Jew who shouldn't be allowed on campus because, I think, specifically, of his Orthodox faith's insistence that he stand up for, say, victims of abortion. Some of the kind of genocidal language that's used in Palestine against Jews in Israel. And that's a threat to them. Why?
Yeah, and it's also a very important litmus test of the left. Not only now that gay marriage has passed, now they're pushing transgenderism, so like human sexuality, and even gay marriage is still at the forefront, I would say. Although it's been legalized through the Supreme Court, we're having Christian bakers and people who have businesses and refuse to serve gay weddings, for instance. They're being targets too. So this is still a really important litmus test to them, as well as the other things you said. I mean, abortion, of course, there is no choice. It's pro-abortion or nothing. But again, there's also this very strong stance against what they like to label as LGBT hatred. We see this on the left all the time against anybody who is mildly associated with religion, and especially because Ben Shapiro is a strong Orthodox Jew, and he doesn't believe in this sort of stuff, and believes in traditional marriage, and he, dares to say so. He is a big threat. So it's like, it's an easy target. They're the bullies, and Christians are the little guys who won't stand up for themselves, and they will target them endlessly. And Ben is, Exhibit A.
Here's the thing. We just got done with a whole century of historically unprecedented bloodshed by mostly secularist progressive regimes, and their primary targets tended to be Orthodox Christians, Jews, and sort of patriots of the various nations who just got uppity about their individual rights. How is it possible that the mainstream left is saying, hey, after that whole bloody century, we're the good guys, and you can tell we are because we're against Orthodox Christians, Jews, and patriots?
Yeah, interesting because, when it comes to socialism or communism, they'll defend it and say, well, we've never actually tried it and implemented it correctly. Like, that's always their stance, so they'll look at, they'll bring up the Crusades or something. And then, Mao and everyone else was slaughtered millions of people in the name of secular ideas. They'll just totally, whitewash that and say, oh, well, socialism and communism have just never been implemented right. So they always get a pass. And then religious people are always their target. It's like Christians, a silent majority, are being bullied. And I think we're starting to see people stand up, especially in the age of Trump, and be more unapologetic about their beliefs. But we need to get judicial nominees in there to actually help us win this fight. We don't want judicial tyranny, of course, that we've seen a lot in the court system. So we'll see what happens. But it's definitely this bully mentality from the left.
Well, it's funny because a lot of the language I hear on the left actually sounds a lot like the catechism, except for it's twisted. Like, we are actually bound by our faith to be, first of all, kindly and accepting toward people with whom we disagree, right? Especially after the Second Vatican Council, we respect, for instance, individual conscience rights, and we're not allowed to use force to try to convert folks and so forth. And also, we have these principles, but sort of more basic Orthodox Christian emphasis on the downtrodden. Of course, Christ famously warned that we should treat the least of these, those who are most marginalized, we should treat them like we treat him. And he warned us if we don't, we're in big trouble. That kind of talk is why we, for instance, stand up for the unborn. And that's what is so distasteful to people like Dianne Feinstein. And what I'm worried about is that the left doesn't have any such sacred book. I don't know if they'll ever correct themselves or where they'll stop.
Yeah, I mean, because their God is some ambiguous, ever-changing thing. It's just climate change or whatever whim they go on where it just increases the power of government. So yeah, you're right. It is kind of endless and can go anywhere. And just also one point that you kind of touched on is that the similarity between maybe leftists in the West and maybe violent extremists of a religious strain is that they're both kind of totalitarian. I mean, they both have this need that everyone will kind of capitulate to their rules, like you will be made to care. And that is kind of an odd connection there between those two groups.
Right. A member of ISIS worships a god who has no morality and can do whatever he wants. Right. So he can dictate without any reason or moral system to hold him back. He can dictate, it's okay for you to rape children. And they're like, oh, okay, God says so. And what I worry about is that the leftist is exactly the same thing, except for he doesn't call his God Allah, he calls it me.
Yeah, that is their God, and they can change at a whim. And there are no boundaries there.
There are no boundaries there. So in other words, what I'm saying is that within the next 5 years, they're going to start killing us in the streets.
Yeah, Probably.
Well, I know, but I mean,
we'll have
seriously.
Trump in office, so we'll be okay. But
Yeah, that's right.
I feel like, and plus, like everyone who abides by the Second Amendment and has firearms is on the right, so we'll be
That's
okay.
true. That's true. But seriously, short of that, what do you think? Do you think there's a real urgent danger in the kind of bigotry that Feinstein expressed, for example, or the kind of bigotry that this campus at Berkeley is expressing toward your boss, Ben? Is there a real danger? How urgent is it that we fight back against it?
I mean, this is a big threat, and I think that's why President Trump won. I don't think there were a lot of Orthodox Christians, Orthodox Jews who, heard the Access Hollywood tape and were like, yeah, that's my guy. No, it was that he was going to stand up for the religious right. And yeah, he was a very flawed messenger, and I'm not going to deny that, but something had to change because we're on such a crash course, thanks to the President Obama administration, with all their, directives and public school directives and such for transgenderism, that we needed a change because it is going very fast and there needs to be something done. We need, for instance, judicial nominees to hold up the Constitution, not abide by, we don't need Sotomayor's in there. We need people who actually go by the Constitution and not their own liberal religious views, which again are atheists, but they're me-centered. Something needs to be done. And again, we've seen this in the protest realm as well with people like Ben Shapiro, conservatives, libertarians, classical liberals are being shut down. They're not allowed to speak. And we've had violence on the street, and people who want to go to these events are being physically assaulted. There was an elderly man who was physically assaulted at one of Ben's speeches in LA, Cal State LA. This happens all the time. So we've already seen the violence. So something needs to be done, and Christians need to stand up and be unapologetic about their views and their stances. And when something like this happens, when Ben is speaking at UC Berkeley and people are opposing him and threatening to shut it down, Ben's going to go and he's going to take a stand. And people like Donald Trump Jr. are making this public knowledge. And we need to keep putting this to the forefront and try to make some changes. Because honestly, I think the American people are with us. We're a silent majority who voted in the president. I mean, so we're not that silent, and we just need to keep getting louder and louder and take a stand.
Amen. Excellent commentary, as usual, from Amanda Prestigiacomo. And you can be followed on Twitter, which I highly recommend, at Amanda Presto.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you ever go by Presto? Does anyone ever call you that?
In high school, I played like soccer and basketball and lacrosse and all that. My coaches would always just say Presto because it was a lot shorter. Because you can't really yell Prestigiacomo on the field.
You can, and you do that thing where you put your fingers together, Prestigiacomo, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
spaghetti.
Yeah, the chef kiss, right?
All right, well, thank you, Amanda. Again, follow Amanda at Amanda Presto, and we look forward to having you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
And now it's time for this week's Political Insights from Catholic Vote Political Director Joshua Mercer. Josh, what is going on this week? We've got a lot of news about the Pope and the President.
That's right. Pope Francis visited Colombia, and on the airplane, he decided to speak to reporters. And when he does that, there's usually fireworks.
Yeah, we love it when he talks to reporters on airplanes. That's what he's famous for. The Airplane Encyclical. It should be a good band name.
Yeah, there you go. It would be a terrible band. No. Right. I mean, so the Holy Father criticized skeptics of climate change. And there's a lot of people who think his remarks were digging at President Trump. With the hurricanes going on, he's flying on his way to Colombia, which is right there in the Caribbean as well. They didn't get as affected by the hurricanes as much, but you've got Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Jose. And so the Holy Father says you can see the effects of climate change with your own eyes, and scientists tell us clearly the way forward. He obviously was not happy that President Trump reversed course on climate change for the United States. He got out of the Paris Accords. In fact, Pope Francis quoted a phrase from the Old Testament, "Man is stupid, a stubborn, blind man." So is that just a reference to anyone who would be a climate change skeptic, or is it more specifically a dig at President Trump? Obviously, the Pope wants to try to let people know about God's creation, that we should all be good stewards of it. But the question about whether or not the entire planet's climate is rapidly changing and that man has an ability to forestall that, because obviously we're marring the planet, so much. I read his encyclical. I was not convinced at all that mankind is hurling the entire planet into some sort of an abyss that if we don't go back, we will go down. I just don't. I don't.
You know why you don't get it, Josh? Because you're stupid.
Obviously, I'm a stupid, stubborn, blind
You're
man.
You're a
That's just great.
stupid, stubborn, blind man. And you know what? Actually, if Democrats had won the 2016 presidential election and given us some carbon taxes, I don't think these hurricanes ever would have happened.
Right. I mean, this is what cracks me up about this, of course. We haven't had bad hurricanes for 10 years. So what did that mean? Is it only because a new person was elected that God decided to send his wrath by throwing? I mean, what's funny about this is that liberals really only believe in divine wrath when it comes to the environment. They don't believe it with regards to, abortion or something else like that. If we ever said, oh, well, God is sending us these earthquakes, hurricanes because of homosexuality or abortion or something like that, the left would go crazy.
But it's so funny to watch leftist commentators who are like, oh my gosh, look at you silly Christians who believe in a fairy in the sky, which is, blasphemy and very insulting to our religion. And then the next minute they turn around and they're saying, very straight-faced, the goddess is angry.
Right. Or
you have wronged
it's
her.
What is it? I thought we lived in a world without God. So why are you trying to preach religion to me now because of the environment? So I find that very interesting. With regards to President Trump, everyone's talking about how Republicans in Congress haven't accomplished really much of anything. They haven't really put substantial legislation on his desk and for him to sign it into law. One thing that Trump has done has simply been to reverse all of the bad executive orders done by Obama, pulling out of the Paris Accords, winding some of this environmental overreach back.
That brings us to the next thing that Pope Francis brought up during his interview on the airplane, right? We're talking about immigration.
Here's what people don't get from the media. This was challenged in court, and DACA was going to die anyway. No matter what you think about it, a federal judge was going to say, I'm sorry, this is just not done constitutionally. You don't change immigration law with the executive order through the president's pen. And it was going to be gone.
Right.
And so President Trump actually did something good, if you believe in the dreamer stuff. He said, let's kick this over to Congress. Let's forestall this judge from kicking out the whole DACA anyway. And let's give the opportunity for Congress to revisit this. During the entire campaign, we all know that Trump was very much in favor of restricting immigration. But even every time when he was doing that, he always telegraphed a willingness to take care of the DACA kids or the dreamers. He didn't want to be heartless.
Right.
It was close to his heart, all that kind of stuff. So this is the deal maker. He's telling Democrats, I will give in on this, but you need to come my way on border security or something, maybe E-Verify, some sort of thing where we can come together, grand bill, sign it, and let's move on.
You and I were talking off the air, and I loved what you said. We owe it to everybody to have a predictable immigration system.
Right. I mean, actually, my great aunt was a Franciscan nun, and she would actually minister to migrants who cross the border. She would just provide them water so they wouldn't die. And my thought is, even if you wanted a more lax immigration policy, let more people in, we need predictability. We owe it to everyone involved. We owe it to the immigrants themselves, to have a sensible, straightforward path. If you want to come into our country to visit, here's what happens. If you want to come and try to become a citizen, here's what it should be. My biggest thing is we owe it to everyone to make sure we have something set in stone, concrete. We can always change. I don't mean set in stone. We can change it a few years later, but we need to have a little bit more sensibleness. And what gets me about this is that the Pope said, I have heard the President of the United States speak. This is the Pope talking. He presents himself as a pro-life man. If he is a good pro-lifer, he should understand that the family is the cradle of life and you must defend its unity. Now, look. The fact is, this is a terrible argument that the Pope is making. I respect him, and I respect the office of the Pope, but I do not like it when people say, if you're pro-life, you should support this other non-abortion policy. And that's very frustrating. I mean, this is one of the things that I've seen time and time again in our politics. And, Stephen, I'll tell you what I find it most frequently. It usually happens when some liberal or Democratic voter who doesn't like abortion, I mean, some typical Catholic Democrat, and they have a guilty conscience because Catholic Democrats have been supporting Democratic politicians who have given a green light on abortion up and down, all around, every way, no restrictions, never. They fight every regulation or common sense restriction on it. And they give hundreds of millions of dollars every year to abortion giant Planned Parenthood. And I think these Catholic Democratic voters have a guilty conscience about it. And so they take any opportunity they can to lash out at Catholics who vote for pro-life candidates.
And the good news there, and I love your insight about the guilty consciences, the great news for Catholic Democrats is that the church is all about guilty consciences and forgiveness. So come on over.
Right.
You don't have to vote for someone you hate. You don't have to vote for Trump. That's not a Catholic teaching.
Well, just think of it this way. What if all the grief that these Catholic Democratic voters give to conservative or pro-life voters, why don't they stick some of that, angst and grief or, and antagonism towards their own Democratic candidates? Like, why don't they demand better pro-life candidates on the Democratic side?
All right. Well, this has been the latest political insight from political director Josh Mercer, who's also the editor of The Loop. If people want to get caught up and stay in The Loop, Josh, where do they go?
It's simple. Go to catholicvote.org/loop and sign up for our free daily email newsletter.
All right. You're listening to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour. I'm Stephen Herreid.
And I'm Josh Mercer.
I'm not gonna get home.
Hello, you're listening to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour. I'm your host, Stephen Herreid, and now we're going to have a conversation with Jason Jones. Jason Jones is a military veteran, a film producer. You may know him from his work on the famous pro-life movie Bella, which is an award-winning film from just a few years back. And today we're going to be talking with him about his mission, how he got started, and what we can do to be like Jason, right, Jason? Do you recommend being like you?
I'm not St. Paul, Stephen, so I'm not going to say if you want to be holy, be like me.
We were just talking just before we started. You have a black belt. Let's start there. Tell me about that.
Well, yeah, I do. I do have a black belt in Kyokushinkai karate, and I was privileged to represent the United States in the Fifth World Tournament in Tokyo, Japan as a young man. So I've always been passionate about martial arts, and I'm blessed to live in Hawaii. So, my hobbies are Muay Thai, MMA, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'm 45, but I live in Hawaii, which is like the Mecca. We have BJ Penn, we have Helson Gracie, we have Haru, who's like the world's best stand-up coach. And so I train with him every day. He's my lunchtime break.
Wow. Every day you do mixed martial arts?
Yeah, I block out, my lunch hour, and I just go to the gym, and I get to train with the guy who, trains champions. It's sort of like, if you're listening and you love baseball and maybe you've been to a fantasy baseball camp, you've gone and practiced with the Yankees or the Cubs or whoever. I get to do that every day at lunchtime. And yeah, I'm blessed.
That's awesome. So you live in Hawaii. Did you grow up in Hawaii?
I didn't. I moved here when I was 17 years old. As I was walking off the plane looking towards the Ko'olau Mountains, I said to myself, I'm never leaving this place. And I've done my best to not have to leave it.
Wow. So you basically spent your whole adult life there. Do you feel bad? Or, I mean, are you sorry because of your white privilege in Hawaii? I mean, do you tower over people and look really white and stand out? Or
well, it's funny. It's funny you should say that. My wife is Chinese and she's from New York, but she's 5'10". When she moved to Hawaii, she told me she hated it because she hated not sticking out, being from New York City, and she felt always special. And I thought that was the weirdest thing I've ever heard. And then 2004, I worked for the RNC in Wisconsin, and I called her from a bar at like midnight, and I said, honey, you're right. I said, it's horrible. I'm in this bar and everybody has blonde hair and blue eyes. I'm not special at all. So I would say in my parish, I do stand out, but my kids don't. What's great about Hawaii, and I don't want to get into a whole conversation on white privilege and race and ethnicity, but it's something I think about a lot because I live in a place that's the most unique polity in the world when it comes to that, because there is not one ethnic majority. And, we live within the United States, but we don't live within the Western world. We live in Polynesia, we live in Asia, really. And so that's something that's very unique. And so my children, of course, are mixed, and but every kid in Hawaii is. That's the beautiful thing. I mean, all the kids look related, and none of the parents do.
Wow. So you have spent pretty much your entire adult life, starting really in your late childhood even maybe, defending the vulnerable. That's what you've done. You've mostly, working through cultural efforts, like with your films, and also through politics. And even as an undergraduate, you were involved in the Young Americans for Freedom?
Yep, Young Americans for Freedom. I founded the Ayn Rand Club at the University of Hawaii and founded the Pro-Life Student Union. So in college, I was a hardcore Randian, And I wouldn't have called myself a libertarian, but I would have, because I was such a hardcore objectivist.
Objectivist.
Yeah, I was an objectivist. I would have called myself an objectivist, although my politics were very libertarian, but I was also very pro-life. I wasn't a Christian. My personal morality in no way reflected conservatism or Christianity. And I used to call myself a Jacobin for Jesus. That there were some areas I agreed with Christians on, and I'd be the Jacobin that would fight for them.
Let's take it right back to the beginning. What got you started, Jason? What motivated you into your tireless work that you've been doing for all these years on behalf of the vulnerable? What was the beginning?
Well, Malcolm X famously said, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock landed on us. And that's how I feel about the culture wars. I didn't choose to be a participant in the culture wars. The culture wars landed on me. I was an irreligious, uneducated American kid from a broken home, like every other home that I knew in my neighborhood. And my parents were married as teenagers. My mother was a junior in high school, but they were divorced before I was even one. I have no memory of, a two-parent family. My mother was married several times, and with each marriage came a sibling or two. And so, that was my childhood. I never went to church a day in my life. And, we didn't discuss Russell Kirk or Edmund Burke around the dinner table. Politics wasn't something we discussed. I was just a normal kid in the south suburbs of Chicago. And on on a Saturday, I was still 16 years old before my 17th birthday. My high school girlfriend came over and rode her bike all the way to my house, which is miles away, and woke me up with the words, "I'm pregnant." And so we spent that Saturday trying to devise a strategy for what we were going to do. And I decided that I would try to join the Army when I turned 17, which was just a couple of days away. I had a friend, not even really a friend, but just a classmate in my photography class of all things, who went right from school to basic training to the Army. So I knew there was this program out there. So I went down to the recruiters, and you had to prove that you were sort of a troubled kid. I was last in my class out of 565 students at Amos Alonzo Stagg High School, class of 89. I give you the specifics because the trolls that troll my story will always say I made that up, which is very flattering. You weren't last in your class. Okay, great. Yeah, I made that up for effect. No, I was last in my class. And I was a bad kid. I mean, I had countless hours of detention. Countless, like dozens and dozens of hours of detention. And so I got into this program and joined the Army. Went off to Fort Benning, Georgia, and joined the infantry. We were going to hide the pregnancy until I got back from basic training, but my high school girlfriend's father found out. And got a call on a Sunday morning while I was cleaning pots and pans because I didn't go to church because I was atheist when the other soldiers went to church. And my high school girlfriend called me and was just wailing, her soul was crying, saying, I'm sorry. And then her father said, we know your secret, and your secret's gone. We took Katie to have an abortion. Oh. And a drill sergeant hung up the phone. I hit him, ran into my captain's office, was dragged into my captain's office, and was just begging my captain to call the police. And when I explained to him what happened, he looked confused. He said, why would I call the police? Don't you know that abortion is legal? And I did not know abortion was legal, as strange as it sounds. I kind of knew it was a thing. I have a vague memory of like really perverse jokes, like dead baby jokes and abortion jokes that people told in the 80s that were really strangely common. Even in the 70s, I remember I was born in 1971, being in elementary school and dead baby jokes were the thing. So I kind of knew there was this thing out there called abortion, but I never thought about it for more than half a second, and I never really knew it was legal. And so I kind of committed my life that day I just wanted to tell America that this was legal. It seemed to me the most preposterous, disgusting thing. So here was a kid last in his class. Now he's a private in the infantry at Fort Benning, Georgia, and I have my mission. In film writing, screenplay writing, this would be referred to as the inciting incident or my call to adventure. It's when I now am leaving the ordinary world and I have this journey. So here I am, an atheist. Now, I wasn't a Randian yet, although Anthem, Harrison Bergeron's short story.
Vonnegut's short story, Harrison Bergeron. Yeah.
Vonnegut's short story, Harrison Bergeron, and Ayn Rand's novella, Anthem. I had read those both in the 8th grade, and those sort of kind of even though I wasn't politically engaged or active, those books, that short story and that novella influenced me greatly. And so I went back to Ayn Rand after the abortion, searching for sort of a ground for my defense of the human person.
Did you find it?
I thought I did. I did. I wasn't. So I started reading Ayn Rand. So I'd read Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead. I have to say I loved Fountainhead. I loved We the Living. Even in my strongest Randian days, I wouldn't say this out loud, I was not a big fan of Atlas Shrugged. Although my dream was to make it into a movie. And in fact, I had the privilege of being in it as an extra with my daughter and Andrew Breitbart, the three of us.
Wow.
Yeah, the three of us together. We're on set in this party scene in Atlas Shrugged. And it was just what a beautiful experience that was to spend the day with my daughter and Andrew talking about Ayn Rand. But it was her nonfiction really captivated me when I read Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, and The Virtue of Selfishness. What was attractive to me about it was all the Christians I was bumping into, especially when I got out of college, got out of the army, went into the university, were really were weak. They were moral relativists. They had no, they'd say, Jason, I'm pro-life, but who am I to judge? And
right.
I used to say it when Christians would say that to me, who am I to judge? Or you shouldn't judge, Jason. I'd ask them if, where they got that, they'd say Jesus, and I'm like, Jesus should read Aristotle, then he wouldn't commit the fallacy of the stolen concept. Of course, Jesus never did say that, did he? He said, judge not like a hypocrite, take the board out of your own eye and then take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. He didn't say, leave the board in your eye so you don't have to go about the important work of helping to get specks out of your friends and neighbors' eyes. But when Ayn Rand would try to give an account for her vision of the human person, she would say it's self-evident or it's axiomatic. And that never satisfied me. And it was then reading Nietzsche, Freud, Sartre that obliterated any hope for human dignity, divorced from revelation.
Now, you're a Catholic.
I'm a Catholic now, yeah.
How did you make your way to revelation? Where did that come from? How did you get here?
I would say, it began with thank you to Sartre and Nietzsche and Freud. And I really wanted to know. I did agree with Ayn Rand that the human person has this incomparable dignity and beauty and worth, and it's self-evident, but that's not really an answer. So I went searching for that, and I was so prejudiced. I really read the Quran before I even read the Jewish scriptures because I had such a strong anti-Christian bias. And so then I got to the New Testament, and I have to say I fell in love with Jesus Christ. And when I was reading the Quran, there was a point I just put it down, and I said, if this is true, God, I'm against you. I said, if this is you, God, I'm with Lucifer. If this is you, when I read the Quran. I didn't say this isn't you. I didn't know. I just said, I'm not with this. But when I read the New Testament, it was exactly the opposite experience. Like, if this isn't you, God, if only you could be this beautiful. That was my thinking. When you come across the life of Christ in Scripture, especially being a religious illiterate that I was, then all I had was the scandal of personal examples. And now I'm not holding that. We're all scandals to somebody, right? I'm a scandal to somebody. We all have weaknesses, and it makes it hard for them to see Jesus Christ if we're the guy running around with Jesus Christ on our sleeve. And then I cut you off and, you cut me off in traffic and I give you the bird. And I've got my, Pray the Rosary Daily bumper sticker. I've just become a scandal, right? So, but I saw Jesus through the people talking to me about Jesus, and none of them were appealing to me. Most of them were just weak and effeminate in defending the vulnerable.
You talk a lot about defending the vulnerable, and you are right now, of course, you're decrying weakness in defense of the vulnerable. Tell me a little bit about your work. What do you actually do? What are the actions you take as a filmmaker and as a human rights activist? What are the definitive works that you've done, and why?
Well, my apostolate is very simple: to promote the incomparable dignity and beauty of the human person, and to advance Catholic social teaching, that beautiful architecture of Catholic social teaching, and to protect the vulnerable. And so I do make movies that share the truth about the human person, and I participate in movies that tell the truth about the human person. A film like Bella, for example, or Crescendo is a short film I made with Patty Millett, the mother of Justin Bieber. I write for the Stream. I also, I had my first book, The Race to Save Our Century, and I just sent my second book to the editor, The World is on Fire. I do activism. That's really my passion. And I have an organization called Servium. And the mission of Servium is simply that, to advance authentic Catholic social teaching, because there are these victimist ideologies that take Catholic social teaching, twist it, pervert it, and use Catholic social teaching to advance their own ideologies, which exploit the weak instead of defend the vulnerable.
Right, exploiting the weak instead of defending them, but we hear about the weak all the time, right? I mean, that's a big part of public discourse. All you hear about is the poor and the vulnerable, but at the same time, you argue often that when people talk, very emotionally about the poor and the vulnerable, oftentimes they're actually just using them rather than doing anything meaningfully to help them. Is that right?
Yeah, when you hear about the preferential option for the poor, more often it means the preferential option for me, or the preferential option for powerful, unaccountable, distant bureaucracies, rather than doing the down and dirty work, which is defending the weak. And that's why, reading René Girard really brought the gospel to light to me, that, the second person of the Trinity became vulnerable for us. As Christians, if you are not becoming vulnerable in your work in solidarity with the vulnerable, then you are a victimist. If you're getting power, economic power, cultural power, spiritual power through your apostolate, if your apostolate is what's giving you power, then what you're really doing is you're exploiting the vulnerable for your own gain. And we see that today in the seamless garment, in these faux life, whole life organizations that are really just ideologies that are being used.
Alternatively, could you draw a conclusion that if, to quote one of my favorite books, The Virginian, there's a guy who says at one point, he says, I'm 28 years old now, and if I didn't have any enemies by now, I'd be ashamed of myself. Something to that effect. Do you think we could draw that conclusion? I mean, there are a lot of people who, they are activists, and they talk a lot about the vulnerable, but in ways that happen to be very much in vogue. They don't find themselves at odds with anyone who is in a real position to hurt them or to do damage. And they have a lot of friends. They don't lose friends. Is that a red alert sign?
Yeah, I saw this in college where, college activists would talk about drilling an Anwar, but would be horrified if you brought up abortion. Well, none of my classmates were clubbing baby seals or drilling an Anwar for oil on their vacation time. But many of my classmates were finding themselves in a position whether or not to choose abortion.
Right. In other words, it takes zero courage to denounce an evil that isn't really present or directly threatening. When you're a student at the University of Hawaii, which I saw, and you're running protests against the clubbing of seals in Iceland, I mean, it's foolish, right? But we see that every day nationally. When you have the bishops in Mexico attacking American Christians who voted for Trump, but they're silent on the cartels. That, again, is just another example of victimism. Well, thank you very much, Jason, for being here and for talking with. Just as a last thought, could you tell us where we can find your work? Yes. Well, our website is serviumusa.org. It means I will serve. Or movie2movement.com. And there's a beautiful movie coming out in September that I hope everyone supports called Because of Gracia. And that website, again, is becauseofgracia.com. You heard the man. Go to becauseofgracia.com. Thank you again, Jason, and stop by again very soon. God bless you, brother. Well, that's all for this week. You've been listening to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour, where fake news and heresies go to die. I'm your host, Stephen Herreid. See you next week.